607, and it is not a transportation company. It's actually a money transfer.
A witness stands at 1311 Nicollet Street in Minneapolis, staring at an empty lot where dozens of transportation vehicles should be parked. But there's nothing there. There has never been anything there. And a man named Mohamed, who claimed to run a massive transportation operation from this address, has completely disappeared into thin air. In Minnesota, investigators began piecing together what appeared to be an elaborate phantom. Someone had been claiming to operate a fleet of transportation vehicles, buses, vans, perhaps even larger commercial trucks, supposedly serving the community. Applications were filed, documents were submitted, money changed hands. But when authorities finally arrived at the registered location, they found something that made their investigation take a chilling turn. The address was real, but the operation was a ghost. The witness who came forward painted an unsettling picture. No vehicles had ever been stationed at this location. No drivers had ever reported for shifts. No maintenance had ever been performed. It was as if someone had conjured an entire transportation company out of thin air, existing only on paper, only in databases, only in the digital footprints left behind in government systems. What made this case particularly disturbing was its scale. This wasn't a small-time fraud. This was systematic, calculated, and part of something much larger. Minnesota had become ground zero for an unprecedented wave of pandemic relief fraud, with over $1 billion vanishing through fake nonprofits and fabricated programs. At the heart of many schemes were operations just like this one, phantom businesses that existed nowhere except in financial records. Mohamed's transportation fraud fit a pattern investigators were seeing across the state. Small nonprofits claiming to serve impossible numbers of people. Organizations reporting activity that defied basic logistics. The infamous Feeding Our Future scandal had seen groups claiming to serve 91 million meals, an absurd figure that should have raised immediate red flags but somehow slipped through oversight gaps that officials would later describe as a catastrophic failure. The question haunting investigators was simple but profound. Where did the money go? When funds were approved for Mohamed's phantom fleet, they entered the banking system, were withdrawn, and then disappeared. This is where the case became not just a matter of fraud, but of international intrigue. Investigators discovered that many fraudsters were using an ancient, informal money transfer system called Hawala. Unlike traditional banking, Hawala operates on trust and leaves almost no paper trail. A person in Minneapolis hands cash to a Hawala broker who makes a phone call using coded language to a counterpart in Somalia. That counterpart then pays out the equivalent amount to the intended recipient, and the two brokers settle their accounts later through a complex web of offsetting debts, like a global bar tab that never actually requires money to cross borders. For investigators at the Department of Justice and Treasury, this created a nightmare scenario. They could trace funds leaving American money service businesses, but once the money entered the Hawala system and reached Somalia, the trail went cold. Ledgers didn't exist. Records vanished. The opacity was absolute. What made Mohamed's disappearance particularly alarming was the timing. His fraud occurred during the same period when Somali-linked nonprofits in Minnesota received over $2.5 million in pandemic relief loans, even as indictments were being handed down for similar schemes. The oversight failures under Governor Tim Walz's administration had created what critics called an open door for fraud on an industrial scale. More than $250 million was confirmed stolen through fake meal programs alone. Housing assistance programs, autism services, child nutrition initiatives all became vehicles for fraud. And through it all, money flowed out of the country through channels investigators could barely penetrate. But who was Mohamed? Where did he come from? And most importantly, where did he go? Authorities faced the unsettling reality that in the modern age, a person can create an entire fictional enterprise, extract significant funds, and then vanish without a trace. Mohamed left behind no forwarding address, no known associates willing to talk, and no clear path for investigators to follow. The witness at 1311 Nicollet Street represented something rare in these cases, someone willing to state publicly that the emperor had no clothes, that the transportation operation had never existed. But even with this testimony, authorities found themselves asking questions they couldn't answer. Had Mohamed ever physically been at this location? Did he work alone, or was he part of a larger network? Was Mohamed even his real name? As the investigation continues, this case represents a watershed moment in understanding how modern fraud operates. The transportation vehicles that never existed, the business address that was real but empty, the money that evaporated into informal financial networks spanning continents. And at the center of it all, a man who seemingly erased himself from existence. Treasury officials have since implemented new restrictions, banning aid recipients from making overseas transfers in the wake of the Minnesota fraud. President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud of Somalia has cooperated with American authorities, strengthening anti-money laundering frameworks. But these measures came after Mohamed and countless others had already executed their schemes and disappeared. The case stands as a stark reminder of how vulnerable systems became during the pandemic's chaos, when urgency trumped verification and oversight collapsed under the weight of unprecedented need. And somewhere, perhaps in Somalia, where remittances make up nearly 15% of the GDP, or perhaps in another country entirely, Mohamed knows the answer to the question that still haunts investigators. How did he make an entire transportation company vanish along with himself, as if neither had ever existed at all?